Hello, everyone. My name is Elena Pineda with Forge Breast Cancer Survivor Center. Welcome to today's coffee conversation. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Nathaniel Robinson with us. He's a researcher at UAB, and he's going to talk to us about all kinds of breast cancer research, things that are going on right now and things that we should know. So Dr. Robinson, I want to thank you so much for carving out the time to be with us this morning. And if you wouldn't mind just starting by introducing yourself to us.
Sure. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. And I grew up in Central Ohio, was born and raised there, and I went to college there, and then I graduated from college, started working. I studied, like the biological sciences, was working in a laboratory setting after I graduated with the intention of going back to graduate school. And about 6 months before I was scheduled to start graduate school, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I was not working research-wise, was not working in the cancer field at that time, but got really interested in it because I now had a personal connection to it. And where I was going to graduate school happened to have a very strong cancer research and clinical program. They have a comprehensive cancer center there. And so I knew that I would be landing in a good spot to try and study the things that I was now really motivated to. So when I got to graduate school, I sought out a lab that studies breast cancer. In particular, that lab and my graduate work focused on how breast cancer metastasizes and how metastatic breast cancer can arise when there doesn't seem to be any evidence of primary breast cancer anymore. I worked in a laboratory setting, so my background, research and training wise, is all on the basic science side. So we did a lot of work in cancer cell lines and in animal models of breast cancer, formation and metastasis. So I graduated with my Ph.D. in 2020. And I was seeking out postdoctoral training. So I accepted a postdoc position at UAB, moved to Birmingham in 2021. And my research now currently is not so focused on cancer, but in the spring of 2022, well, I should say that after my mom was diagnosed, she had a mastectomy and was on, anti-estrogen therapy for several years, and did well, tolerated that pretty well, and showed no signs of recurrence or anything like that, was doing really well. She eventually stopped her anti-estrogen therapy, and we were all, of course, very happy, and she was still doing well. And then in the spring of 2022, she was having some neck problems. And to make a long story short, she found out that she had a cervical vertebra fracture from a breast tumor that had metastasized to her spine. And so she was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer at that point. So she's currently, on treatment, and her neck problems have all been fixed surgically and everything. She's doing very well, all things considered. She takes it day by day, but she has a very positive outlook. She's been responding to her treatment so far, so that's all been great. But again, similar to when I was starting grad school, her experience made me really motivated to reconnect with the breast cancer community, because I was not getting that so much on my professional side at this point. And so I was seeking out breast cancer focused organizations here in Birmingham, came across Forge, reached out, and was lucky enough to be able to set up this conversation, which I'm really excited to have.
Well, we are thankful to have you here in the Birmingham area, and I'm sorry to hear about your mother's diagnosis and just that you have such a personal connection to breast cancer, but very thankful that there are individuals like you out there that are so motivated, to do the work that's needed so that, we can address it and hopefully make changes going forward. I know that you mentioned a little bit in your introduction kind of that there's basic science or bench science, and then there's, more clinical science. I'm wondering if you can give just the briefest overview for someone who may not, be very familiar with what cancer research looks like.
Sure. So I'll actually start on the clinical side, because that's the side I think that's more familiar to most people, especially people who have been in clinical settings, dealing with or thinking about breast cancer. So clinical research involves both researching how new treatments work in people living with a certain disease like breast cancer, or looking at sort of long-term or like over time, looking at outcomes either associated with like something that may cause a specific disease or long-term outcomes for a treatment. So, you know, the first thing I said about testing new treatments, those are clinical trials. I think everybody probably has a general sense of what clinical trials are, that they exist. Certainly, maybe some have even participated in them themselves. And the other types of studies are, there's various designs, but that people may have heard the terms like cohort studies and case control studies and things like that. So all of that falls under the umbrella of clinical research, but it's all working with people generally who have a given disease or now there are even clinical trials related to caregiver, interventions with caregivers and so forth. But in any case, it's always connected to a specific clinical condition. To take a step back from that into what all my training and experience is in is what I said called the basic science side, or the bench science side. There, we're working strictly in a laboratory setting. We don't work directly with people. Sometimes we'll work with samples that are collected from people, like a cell line or a blood sample or something like that. But a lot of our work is focused in what we call model systems. So those are experimental systems that are developed to model, as the name suggests, a particular disease or process that we're interested in studying. So, for example, common model systems that are used in breast cancer basic science research and that I've used in the past include breast cancer cell lines. So those are cell lines taken from oftentimes breast tumors that have been, say, removed surgically or something, or biopsied, and then turned into cell lines that can be grown over time. And, we can do different experimental manipulations too. Another common model system that we use is animal models. So in that case, in the context of breast cancer or any cancer, we will often somehow induce breast cancer in an animal. That can either be through some sort of, again, experimental manipulation to the animal, or it can be by taking a cell line and putting it in an animal, which will then kind of go to their breast tissue, or if you're studying metastasis, then it may go elsewhere in their body. But in any case, it's meant to mimic the human clinical conditions in an animal system, where the advantage of doing that is, or the power of doing that over something like just an isolated cell line, is we can, as best we can, model or account for all the different complex aspects that make up, a living body that might influence breast cancer formation or progression or metastasis or whatever aspect of it that we may be interested in.
Boy, isn't science incredible? I mean, truly, it's impressive what can be done, for sure. And I'm wondering if you could speak to just kind of what is happening right now in breast cancer research. What are those breakthroughs? Because I mean, it sounds like it's an ever evolving. You really have to keep up with things to kind of see what's going on.
Yeah. So my overall attitude about the state of breast cancer research and breast cancer treatment, and I say this with all due respect to people who, maybe have had challenges with their own treatment or something, but the state of breast cancer treatment and where breast cancer research for new treatments is moving makes me very optimistic. It makes me excited about the power of science that you're talking about, because even in the last 10 or 15 years, and I think even more so in the next 10 to 15 years, we're developing, at the same time, we're developing a more advanced and complete understanding of what breast cancer is, or what a breast tumor is. And I'll touch more on that in a second. But at the same time, we're also developing these really, really powerful technologies that allow us to gather a lot of data relatively quickly and easily and inexpensively, and then use that to understand not just breast cancer as a whole disease, for a general disease or a phenomenon, but specific aspects of an individual person's breast cancer that may help ultimately to inform how they may be treated, or what their prognosis is, or other clinical aspects or decisions that are made. So I'll just give a 1,000-foot overview of kind of on the biology side, kind of where things are at in terms of our understanding, historically, and even today, to some extent, we think of a cancer as a tumor, this ball of cells that have grown and grown and grown and overgrown. That's fundamentally what a cancer is a cell, a type of one cell or a group of cells that have become overgrown relative to what they normally are supposed to do. So in the breast, for example, those are breast cells of the breast. They grow, and when they form a breast tumor, they grow and grow and grow, and that's why you wind up with this big ball of cells. That's what a tumor is. But we have cancer is not just a tumor, and what I mean by that is that the development of a tumor or the progression of cancer as a disease, say from localized to regional or from regional to metastatic, requires not just those tumor cells that have overgrown, but it requires a lot of other things to make those cells, to push those cells to behave in a way that makes them spread or makes them more aggressive or it makes them resistant to treatment, for example. All those challenges that we see clinically with treating breast cancer and other cancers. So to be specific, we think of tumors now as what we call ecosystems. And that might seem like kind of a vague word, but when we think of an ecosystem like in nature on Earth, an ecosystem is made up of multiple plants and animals, different living species that all have back and forth relationships with one another. And we now think of cancers that way because cancers are not just tumor cells, but they are also other cell types around the tumor and throughout the body that have back and forth relationships with those cancer cells. So for example, when a tumor forms, tumors are bad. We have an intuitive understanding of that, but our body also doesn't like having tumors in it. And so it can try to mount responses to stop tumors before they start or when they are very early on in developing. The main tool that our body uses for doing that is the immune system. And so tumors need a way to tell the immune system to back off. We call that immune suppression or immune evasion. Because if a tumor can put the brakes on the immune system, then that will allow it to keep growing instead of being knocked out by the immune system, which is the job of the immune system, to knock bad things out of our bodies. Tumors also need, as they're doing all this growing and growing and growing, that requires a lot of energy and a lot of nutrients. They need oxygen, they need sugar, they need other nutrients. And so they require some of that they can produce themselves, but they also require other sources of it in order to keep up with that really high demand. And so they need a blood supply, for example. Blood will bring oxygen and bring nutrients right to the tumor. And so tumor cells have ways of telling blood vessels around it to say, hey, come this way. The proper term for that is vascularization. And so that's just a couple examples of what we now are understanding is a much more complex, cancers are much more complex systems than we used to think or thought historically. And the reason that's important is because when we think about developing new treatments for breast cancer or other cancers, one, we don't just want to account for features of the tumor cells because there's all this other complex interplay going on that's important for the tumor's growth and potential spread. But on the flip side, and what makes me optimistic about all this is those, the more aspects there are to that system, the more potential there are targets there are for new treatments. And so, for example, people have worked both preclinically in a laboratory setting and clinically in clinical trials and so forth on treatments that that vascularization process, or at least slow it, block it, try to block it. So tumors can no longer say, hey, blood vessels, come over here. I need what you've got, what you're delivering. There are now, and this is particularly prominent in other cancers like lung cancer, there are now there are immune modulating therapies. So people may have seen commercials for things like Opdivo, or the generic terms nivolumab. And what those do is, ordinarily, the tumor is putting the brakes on the immune system around it. And so those immune therapies now, first of all, will help take the foot off that brake, but actually also put a foot on the gas. And so they'll ramp up the immune response to a tumor. And in the case of lung cancer, for example, these new immune therapies have really changed the game in terms of how lung cancers are treated, but also the outlook for people with lung cancers, which historically have had pretty poor outcomes. And there are just now starting to be clinical trials and a more dedicated push clinically to move those immune therapies into treating breast cancer. And so that's right on the horizon, really.
That is exciting. So it sounds like there's really a development in the different levers, right, that can be pushed and pulled to make a difference. Like perhaps it's not just about removing, that there are these different ways that it can be tweaked to change that ecosystem that you're talking about.
Exactly. And so as we now pivot to the technology side briefly, as we leverage these new technologies that allow us to look at a given breast cancer and say, oh, instead of just being able to look at tumor cells, now we can actually get a sense of all of these different components using these new technologies, things like people may have heard in general about in the media, like people may have heard terms like omics or sequencing, single cell technologies, even artificial intelligence, which I think can be a loaded term sometimes, but in its best form can be used to take a small set of data and learn a lot from it to make big conclusions. The amount of information we can generate from a single experiment or looking at a single tumor or experimental system, the amount of information we can generate, and the degree to which we can extend that to thinking generally about breast cancer as a process and thinking about treating breast cancer, general approaches to treating breast cancer, we're really starting to enter a golden age, I think, not to sound overly dramatic about it, but it's really exciting, honestly, working with and around those technologies as someone who has worked without them before, did all my training largely without those types of things available at hand. Those technologies allow us to, as I said, get personalized. People may have heard the term personalized medicine before. So to learn personalized or personal features of a single person's breast cancer, that it may lead a clinician to say, for example, hey, your breast cancer has this specific molecular feature, which we couldn't detect before. We didn't have the technology, the resolution to see that. Now we do, similar to how clinicians look at estrogen receptor and HER2 expression, and that informs treatment. I think we're at a point where we will start to see that a type of approach on steroids, for lack of a better way of putting it, and really, be able to drill down into an individual's the molecular features of their tumor to inform treatment selection, and also, again, assert new targets for developing treatments. Because if we see specific features for one person, and then for 2 people, and then for 10 people, and then for 1,000 people, then it's like, okay, well, that may be something that's really important for breast cancer generally, but that we didn't know before because we didn't have a way to look at it.
Yeah. Well, I just want to even say mid-conversation here, I'm so appreciative of kind of how you're describing these things. It does feel like research is this amorphous thing that, I know nothing about. I'm not in that area, but I feel like you've done a tremendous job really helping us here understand kind of the very direct clinical implications when it comes to this personalized approach, but also the kinds of things that are happening, in the labs with technology that, again, are helping inform everything that's happening now. And I'm curious what you think, if this is a good next question. So there is a lot of clinical, a lot of that science that's happening, but I know that there is still research when it comes to more holistic approaches to managing a cancer diagnosis or preventing one, whatever it is. And I know that's an area that you were also interested in. So I'm wondering if you can speak some to the research in that area of science.
Yeah, absolutely. The research, as we talked about a little bit at the beginning, the research approach to those types of questions is very different from what I have done in the past and a lot of what I've talked about up to this point today. That's more on the clinical side, and that's equally valuable and equally rigorous. And so I'm not setting up that distinction in order to say, well, the basic science side is really how we're going to learn everything and not on the clinical side. The clinical side is equally important, if not more important, because that's where we find out what really works in people living with this disease. So, just as cancer is not just a tumor, living with breast cancer is not just having breast cancer. I don't have to tell, everyone in this audience knows that better than I do, I'm sure. There are lots of things that come along with having breast cancer that may be attributable to the disease. But when you get quote unquote treatment for breast cancer, when you get a targeted therapy like an anti-estrogen or Herceptin, or get chemotherapy or radiation or surgery, those things are treating the physical cancer. But there's a lot of aspects of living with breast cancer that are not, that doing that doesn't necessarily totally remove or fix or treat. So these, things like, a lot of people live with pain associated with, with breast cancer. A lot of people have side effects from the treatments. In fact, I would venture to say that most people probably have some side effects from the treatments. All these things are aspects of living with breast cancer that we as a research enterprise think about clinically and we realize are important. It's not just enough to say, okay, we cut out the tumor, so now we've taken care of your breast cancer. So a lot of these holistic, or the term I like to use is sort of integrative or complementary interventions, have to target more those aspects of the experience of breast cancer. I'll just add as a sort of concise way to put it. When I was in medical school, one of the first things they taught us was the distinction between a disease and an illness. I think on the surface, those things seem synonymous. But what I learned is that disease is breast cancer. It's all the, cellular and molecular features that I just kind of alluded to in our previous question. An illness is a person's experience of living with disease. And so it includes the disease, but it's not just limited to that. And so we want to, when we think about treatments or management, we don't want to just think about disease. We want to think about illness. And so there are a lot of sort of lifestyle practices, I guess you could say, that one, have a good evidence base for being effective in managing some of the illness aspects of breast cancer, things like pain, side effects from treatment, even subjective quality of life, which is extremely important for a lot of people. That's understandably the most important thing, other than, do I still have cancer, is how is this going to impact my quality of life? So thinking about interventions for that is extremely important. And as a good rule of thumb, what I'll say is that lifestyle practices we know to be generally healthy tend to be helpful in a lot of specific diseases, including breast cancer, and there's a good evidence base for showing that they are useful. So those are things like regular activity, exercise, eating a healthy diet, and specifically, there's pretty good evidence about kind of sticking to like the high protein, low fat, like Mediterranean type diet. I think people are becoming increasingly familiar with. Um, reducing stress, which of course is oftentimes easier said than done, but there are specific practices like meditation, yoga, acupuncture. Actually, there's very good evidence to suggest that it's useful for reducing some of these illness type aspects of breast cancer pain, side effects of treatments, and improving quality of life. Fortunately, as I said, this is not my area of expertise, but fortunately there are a lot of really good and reliable and rigorous resources for learning more about these sort of complementary, quote unquote, complementary or integrative approaches. So for example, a lot of national cancer, interest organizations, things like the American Cancer Society. For breast cancer, things like the Susan Komen Foundation. Metastatic breast cancer has the Metaviver Foundation. I'm not sure. That one I think is less familiar or less like well known in the public consciousness. But all those organizations have can connect people with, even online through their websites, with resources about not just treatments, available treatments, clinical trials, emerging treatments, but also some of these lifestyle and other complementary aspects to managing breast cancer and maximizing quality of life. Another resource that I'll point out specifically is, excuse me, the National Institutes of Health. One of the National Institutes of Health is the National Cancer Institute. And there's also a separate institute in the NIH called the National Institute for Complementary, I had the name and then I just lost it. National Institute for Complementary Health, NICCH, I think is the acronym. If you just search NIH complementary, it would be the first one that came up. So there's that institute, and then the National Cancer Institute has something called OCCAM, the Office for Cancer Complementary and Alternative Medicine, OCCAM. Both of those are really gold mines of information about complementary and integrative approaches or interventions or practices that are useful for all types of cancers, including breast cancer. A lot on those websites are broken down oftentimes by cancer type, and they cite references. So they they are very open and transparent about the evidence basis for these things, or if there's a lack of an evidence base, they also note that, because there can be a lot of misinformation out there. And so this helps to balance the scales on that end as well. So, as much as I as limited as I can speak to some of these holistic aspects, I do know, again, that there's good evidence that, generally healthy lifestyle practices that we are all familiar with and a lot of us may engage with, like physical activity, healthy eating, reducing stress, social support and social interaction as well. That's true for caregivers as well. I'll note, since I know this organization, Forge, has a heavy component of thinking about caregivers. Those things all have good evidence bases for improving quality of life and reducing some of those illness aspects of breast cancer. And in some cases, even like exercise, for example, there is evidence to suggest that doing those things even reduces the risk of recurrence, breast cancer recurrence, can reduce mortality, can extend life, health, the health span, so to speak. So I would encourage those of you who are interested in learning more about those things, in as much as my very brief description is probably a very superficial overview, to look for some of those resources to learn more, to ask your healthcare providers as well, because especially, assuming everyone would be seeing an oncologist, they should hopefully be at least reasonably well versed in the evidence basis for some of these things for healthy practices to integrate into your cancer management plan, and can point you in the direction of even more resources than the ones I've just given as well.
Well, it is also nice to know. I imagine that there's a lot about the cancer experience that feels out of control. A lot of, showing up to doctor's appointments, being told what the next step is, and really just having to live it. And so it is nice, to maybe a lot of these possible interventions sound really familiar, but the resources that you've pointed us to really do speak to the evidence-based nature of them, right? So you can feel, good and in control of a little bit that's going on in life.
Yeah, I mean, it like, if someone's just looking online or looking on like trying to inform themselves even through social media or things like that, which is totally reasonable to want to do, it can feel like information overload a lot, and it's really hard to know what's true and what's not, how reliable a particular claim is, and so forth. So sticking to, health and professional interest health organizations and professional interest organizations that are focused on cancer in particular is a good starting point for finding reliable resources. And what I'll say as well, that they're very complete in the sense that they don't just say, oh yes, healthy diet and exercise are good for this, this, and this, but it also talks about common things people will try that either there's no evidence base to suggest that they help really, or it will even point out things that are known to be harmful even, or might be contraindicated with particular treatments and so forth, might like interfere with the effectiveness of certain treatments. So those are very complete resources in that they present both sides of the story as well. So that's why I think they're particularly useful.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, and don't take every thing that you find on TikTok, right? For
Yeah, exactly.
for evidence and what you need to be
Exactly.
doing. What about, so I know, and I'm watching our time too. I know again that you've talked that clinical is not really your focus area, but I know that the idea, right, of a clinical trial, which you brought up earlier, is something that might be on people's minds. It might be on a pamphlet in a doctor's office. It might be something a doctor brings up or they find online. Can you kind of speak to just, high level, kind of what that is, maybe what people should be aware of, maybe before they talk to their doctors?
Yeah. So, in terms of what a clinical trial is, it's testing to see if a new experimental therapy is, experimental at that time, in the sense that we're not sure whether it works. It's a test to see, one, the first test is it safe? That's always the first test. If you ever hear the term phase 1 clinical trial, that is strictly a test for safety. In fact, often it's not even done in people with the specific disease that the drug is targeted for. So that's just to get a sense of, side effect profiles and how well tolerated it is generally. Phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, for people who are familiar with those terms, are the efficacy trials. So those are tests in people with breast cancer, for example, to see how effective those treatments are. Phase 2 is usually a smaller study. Phase 3 is usually a bigger study. Phase 3 is sort of the gold standard for can we make this drug now commercially available to people? And so when a clinical trial is designed, the people running the trial will define what they call endpoints, or things of interest, things that they're interested in seeing. For safety, they'll look for specific side effects. For efficacy, they'll look at, did this increase survival, or did it reduce recurrence? Did it reduce metastasis? Those types of things. And so those are predefined. People will be studied over a predefined amount of time to get, whatever, depending on whatever endpoint they're interested in. That could last months or it could last years. Sometimes clinical trials will be published and can provide the basis for a drug's approval, but still there's additional follow-up once the drug is on the market. Those are informally called phase 4 clinical trials. And so, yeah. And so those are big picture, how clinical trials are set up and what they're meant to look at. In terms of getting involved with clinical trials, every clinical trial has its own enrollment criteria. So some clinical trials, for example, may only be for patients who haven't responded to the existing standard of care or a certain number of treatments. Some may be for people whose cancers have specific molecular features. Some may be for cancers at a certain stage. Like, for example, there are specific treatments on the market now for metastatic breast cancer that are not given for primary breast cancer. And that, those would have been the designs in the clinical trial as well. If you are interested generally in clinical trials or find information about a specific clinical trial, the first step is always to talk about it with your healthcare provider. Hopefully they will be knowledgeable about it. If they're not, they will know who is or where they can find more information about it. They can help sort through some of the technical jargon about inclusion criteria and endpoints and molecular features and stuff that can, I think it's pretty easy to get lost in that type of information if you're not used to looking at it, as, day in and day out. So they can help sort of, pull back the curtain a little bit in that regard. And what I will say is that for cancers generally, and breast cancer specifically, clinical trials are generally designed. There's no placebo arm in some clinical trials. For other conditions, there is a placebo arm. For cancers, generally the non-experimental arm is the standard of care. So everybody's going to get treated. The quote unquote, well, I don't want to say worst case scenario because not all experimental treatments and clinical trials work, but the alternate to receiving the experimental treatment is receiving the treatment you would receive anyway. So the question really boils down to, is the experimental treatment something that is appropriate for your particular case? And, there's other practical matters as well, like is it being done at or close to the place where you normally get care or in your city, or, is the closest one 500 miles away or whatever. It's lots of practical considerations as well. But on the scientific side, that's kind of the big picture.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that detail. I know that, you hear clinical trials a lot, just reference, but maybe don't know the specifics. And so I do think that that was a really helpful overview, for anyone who might be interested in diving in a little bit more. I know that we're coming to the end of our time, but I know that there are a lot of national organizations that have kind of supporting research is a huge component of their mission, right? And so a lot of times that is making sure that the funding, is there for researchers like you and many others across the country to be doing the kind of work that they are doing. But I'm curious, are there any non-fundraising things that individuals who are passionate about the idea of research, who are impacted by breast cancer and want to do good for people, years and years to come, are there ways that they can somehow get involved and be supportive of research efforts? Because it sounds like there's a lot, there's a lot going on, a lot of exciting things happening.
Yes, definitely. And in fact, the cancer community, and in my experience, the breast cancer community, this is a strength of the cancer research community compared to a lot of other, research communities focus on specific diseases, is that patient advocacy is a central part of conferences, like professional conferences, scientific conferences I would go to as a graduate student, always had patient advocates in attendance. There was usually a patient advocacy session where patient advocates are people living with or who have lived with that particular disease, who now, exactly what you said, want to get involved in supporting research efforts and helping to set the research agenda. As scientists not living with breast cancer, even those of us who have a personal connection to it in some way, we don't have the insights that someone who lives with that disease has. We can't. And so in my mind, it's critical for people who do have those insights to be at the table, so to speak. So I'm not entirely sure procedurally what goes into becoming a patient advocate, but I think getting involved with some of the organizations that support research through granting and so forth, they will often also have patient advocacy components to them. So that would be a good place to start. Even something as it might seem like, this may not work, or this has a low chance of having an impact or whatever. But as a researcher, even hearing if someone reached out to me and said, I'm so-and-so, and I was diagnosed with breast cancer in whatever year, and here's my experience, and I want to learn more about what you're doing and how I can support it. Researchers really love to hear from people with those types of messages because it grounds us in what we're doing. And again, it allows us to better inform our approach to our own research. The last thing that I can think of is, and this is not cancer specific per se, but certainly would overlap with it, is any academic institution that conducts research involving humans has what's called an institutional review board. And those are panels that look at the ethical components of human subjects research and approve human subject studies, or say, we're not approving it and here's why, and you need to make this better. And every institutional review board has at least one community member on it. So not a scientist or someone affiliated with the university. Again, procedurally, I'm not totally sure how one gets on an IRB as a community member, but it's not only possible, it's necessary for an IRB to function. So that would be another way to get involved, not just in breast cancer research, but for those who may have a broader interest in human subjects, clinical type research. An IRB would see all kinds of, see a wide range of different types of studies come across their desk. So that's another way that I can think of off the top of my head.
That's great. Again, I'm so appreciative of how specific, obviously, each individual, depending on what they're interested in, there's work to be done to go figure out what the next steps are. But I think you've brought up some very specific things that people can go and look for and look to do, which is very nice. Really, last question is just, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave everyone with today?
Yeah, so I guess my final thought will be, I'll return to something I said at the beginning, which is that in spite of all the challenges I know that come with living with breast cancer, and sometimes figuring out what the right treatment is, or changing treatments, or feeling really crappy when you're on treatment, I'm sure everyone's degree of hope that they have about their situation ebbs and flows. It's completely understandable. But I just want to emphasize that we are really in an exciting time on the research front, where we are getting an increasingly detailed understanding of what cancer is and how cancers change across their progression. And at the same time, we are developing and leveraging really, really sophisticated technologies to get a very detailed view of those biological aspects, and take those very, zoomed in, take that very zoomed in view and use it to inform new approaches to treatment and specific targets for treatment. So I think we're really starting to enter, or have just entered, a renaissance of sorts for personalized medicine in breast cancer and other cancers, and the development of new targeted therapies. And I think it's a really exciting time, and there's a lot of reason for optimism on the research and clinical side, even at times where in the day-to-day, it may be hard to find reasons to be optimistic. So I'll just leave everybody with that.
Well, that's incredible. And I echo what one of our members here today said, that love being able to hear these encouraging words. So it does sound like it's an exciting time. Happy that passionate individuals like yourself are so excited about the things that are happening and involved in the things